Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the second episode of Trending Echoes, happening right here at COP28 from the beautiful Expo City in Dubai. And today we're joined by a very special guest who I'm really excited about. He is the acting managing director of CNN Al-Iqtisadiyya, Mr. Mustafa Al Rawi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Omar. It's great to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity from Trends as well to be part of this dialogue. As you said, it's very exciting times. We're at COP28 at Expo. And also very serious times as well. You know, we do have a climate emergency going on.
Right. Now, this is probably the event of the year. I mean, I don't know if you saw what was happening in the past couple of days. I mean, global leaders, everybody was here, and there's a lot happening. What's your first impression on everything that's taken place, meaning here in Dubai, COP28, happening now in Dubai compared to everything else that we've seen in the past?
So the initial numbers indicate it's the biggest COP ever in terms of attendance. And certainly anecdotally, as I walk around what's called the Blue Zone, the UN administered area where the negotiations are taking place, and you have a number of sidelines and panels. And as you said, the leaders are there right now, making pledges and giving speeches about what their countries are doing. It does feel like there is a lot of gravity here. A lot of people have gathered to meet what is the challenge of our generation, how to slow global warming, how to transform our energy systems, how to build a more sustainable future, and how to get to net zero carbon emissions.
Absolutely. Now, what we want to talk about today, I mean, is what sort of role does the media actually play with everything that we've just mentioned here? Or how impactful can the media actually be?
So if I talk from the perspective of the mainstream media, because there are my colleagues who are dedicated climate reporters, and there are many climate media outlets and media brands that specifically look at this issue all year round. But if I talk about the mainstream media, and in particular CNN Al-Iqtisadiyya, then our role has several functions. We have an audience, and our audience needs to know why what is happening here is important. So that's one of the first things that we try and focus on. We also try to be informative and engaging. But at the same time, as journalists, at the most basic level, we have to hold to account the process and what's happening. We've been told since 2015, since the Paris Climate Agreement,
Right.
That this process of COP is the route to resolving the climate emergency. Now, over the last few years, we've seen that narrative really tested by what's actually happening on the ground.
Right.
So as journalists here, we're trying to understand what is the reality, where is the action, what is the impact, to deliver that information, that message to our audiences, so they know, almost sitting as observers or helplessly, if you like, on the sidelines
Right.
of what's happening here. We're trying to give them some insight into what it actually means.
You just said something interesting. You said solving this crisis. Let's define solving this crisis. I mean, at what point do we say that it is solved?
So the stock take, which is one of the major things that are happening at COP28, the stock take from Paris, is supposed to assess how the countries, the nearly 200 countries, delivered on their promises to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, we haven't seen the final result, but it's been well trailed that it's not good news.
Right.
So I think, the various estimates, but at least 1.1 degrees hotter right now. We've had 2023 on record as being the hottest year ever. And I think to some estimates, we're even maybe, just about hitting 1.5. By 2030, to keep 1.5 degrees in reach, we have to make some drastic changes to how the world works. Now, what's happening at COP is there's a debate over how to get there. And for example, one major contentious issue, which really applies to the media and how we cover it, is you have a group, a lot of voices, particularly in the developed world, who are saying that we must stop fossil fuels now, immediately. Cut it off like we moved to cut off tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are other voices all around the world, whether it might be in Scotland or in the UAE or elsewhere in Africa, that say, if you switch off the current system without having the next system in place, not only are you condemning populations to suffer, shortages of power, but also you're stifling the growth and the prosperity that those people need that haven't reached the same cycle that developed countries have. However, if you don't commit to a very fast, at least very, very fast phase down of fossil fuels, then where will the impetus and the direction be to actually ramp up clean energy to meet that gap? So this is the tension that we have, for example. And so as a journalist, when you're trying to cover that, it's very, very hard to get all the voices into what is a nuanced argument. And sometimes you can fall into either side. You can fall into only sort of amplifying the voices that are saying stop fossil fuels now, or you're, constantly talking to those in whether it's oil producing countries or oil and gas companies or people in developing economies who are saying, wait a minute, let's be a bit more realistic about this. So what COP gives you is a chance in one place, in a very practical way, to try and report on that nuanced story, that complex story. And maybe given these 2 weeks, our audiences as well might have, for want of a better word, the patience to actually, take in all of this instead of, sadly in this fragmented media world, looking for the loudest, the most alarmist voices or the most sort of polarized voices, which is typically what happens in any story.
Right. What's really interesting about what you said, Mustafa, is how you spoke about having different voices, people with different opinions or on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to what we're seeing. And you did mention having another system in place. Now, a lot of people would believe that having that replacement system, I mean, it'll be great if we define it, right? But having that replacement system isn't necessarily any better. What do you think about that? I mean, if we're switching completely to electric vehicles, windmills, and so on, is that actually better? And if so, how much or how better is it than what we have now in terms of fossil fuels?
So there's two aspects to this. So there is the need to really ramp up clean energy capacity. So one of the things they're discussing at COP is tripling that capacity. And that's the least we need. By 2030, tripling the amount of solar, wind, other clean energy sources. You also have a big debate going on today, again, while we're at COP28, today's the third day, about nuclear. So some countries have committed maybe 24 to ramping up nuclear, but there's a really big opposition to nuclear because of some of the disasters. Say, Japanese activists are saying this is dangerous, don't go down this route. But at the same time, we need a mix that is not just sustainable and clean, but also there's an energy security aspect to this. We don't have the technology to store solar yet. Wind doesn't work everywhere. Also, you're going to have, take a country like Morocco that has probably great factors for wind and solar. They're going to supply all of Europe, but then within Europe itself, if they don't have enough access to clean energy and they can't always rely on Morocco, shouldn't they have their own sources that don't require another country or another region to help them? I mean, we see some of the problems of the current energy system. And this is what I interviewed last year, Amos Hochstein, the US energy envoy. And he talked about the fact that in the middle of this argument about what the new system should be like, which seems to be very ideologically driven, whether you're against or looking for a more realistic aspect on fossil fuels, we have to say what didn't work about this system that we have now, so that when we create a new one, it's better, it's put in place in a better way. So what issues do we have with the current system? You have resources concentrated in a region like the Middle East, for example. Amount of politics and geopolitics and insecurity about energy supplies and what that does to the world and world economies over the last 50 or 60 years goes to show that the new system has to be more equitable, fairer, and more evenly spread out. And if you'll allow me to talk about electric vehicles. So as a journalist, right, I'm constantly asking myself about electric vehicles and forgive me, but like every time I see a Tesla, it really annoys me because the car companies, in my lifetime at least, have been the best at marketing their product, right? You're not just buying something to get you from A to B, you're buying something that says, that makes a statement about who you are as a person when you buy a car, what you drive. Or it sets a statement, people look at it. I mean, this is the world we live in. It is a materialistic world in many ways. And so it's not just transport. I'm sure it was the same with horses, right? It wasn't just, a horse to get you from A to B, but whether you had a thoroughbred or an Arabian or you had 4 horses or a stable or whatever it was. But so now with electric vehicles, yeah, it sounds like it's an ideal solution to the emissions that are coming from the transport sector. But to your point, what about the batteries and the natural resources that are required? And where are most of those natural resources? Mainly in China.
Right.
So again, we have that same discussion of if all the resources we need for the solution to our transport issues in terms of climate are all in one country, aren't we setting ourselves up for more conflict and more problems and everything later on? And, you know, this COP is taking place, unfortunately, with the backdrop of what's happening in Gaza. And as a journalist, we knew that COP was happening, obviously. It's a really important story. But we had Gaza as well, and that's, you know, the tragedy of it, and particularly for our audience as an Arabic-speaking audience, the emotion around it. So you're coming into COP, and it's not just stop on Gaza, start on COP. It doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Not for us as journalists, not for audiences. And even you're seeing in the first few days that first of all, there's almost like, what did Politico call it? A shadow summit going on at COP, where loads of officials are talking about solutions to Gaza. And you have the Israeli president here who's essentially going around and talking about the threat of Hamas. And that's all going on. And the Iranians walked out of COP28, according to reports on Friday. And so that's all going on as well. So, you know, as a journalist, you kind of got to tie it all together a little bit. And King Abdullah of Jordan actually helped. And he said in his speech that you can't separate conflict from climate. First of all, climate, and we've seen that with what happened in the Arab region, climate instigated instability economically in terms of food supply, for example, in Syria, which helped set the tone, amongst other things, not the only thing, for what happened with the uprisings. And so climate impacts people's lives and livelihoods in this region in the Middle East, impacts potentially conflict here and elsewhere. So you can't talk about things separately. So again, I think our trouble as journalists today more than ever, and I think everyone's had this problem in previous generations, but it feels more sharp now, we're at the sharp end of it, is how do you tell a very complex story that requires a lot of time and effort and information when most of your audiences are time poor, very impatient, and are being bombarded with all kinds of information all the time. And so even in our own newsroom, every day we have to remind ourselves, why does this matter? What are we trying to tell our audiences? And sometimes even as journalists, we can get caught up in our own egos and want to be, you know, in the big story and in the middle of it. And I think there is a temptation to kind of get carried away as well. And so it's a privilege to be here. It's a very important story. And as a journalist, I'm very happy that I get to do this. I don't say, oh my God, I've got to get up and get through the crowds and go through security. No, I get to do this. I'm very lucky. But also there is a responsibility. And if you'll allow me this last point around all of this, you can't make everyone happy with your coverage. And again, that's become increasingly the point, is that it used to be when it was print papers or television broadcasts, we all kind of got the same news.
Right.
And we might like it or we might not like it, but we kind of accepted that's the news. And now we have so much more choice. So we don't even have to accept the platform or the medium that's coming to us, even if it's there. We can just say, look, I'm not interested in that. I'll get my news somewhere else.
Right. So with that being said, and this is very interesting, I actually heard a term today or yesterday called, what was it? It was sustainable literacy, sustainable environmental literacy, something like that. Now, what that pretty much means is being able to get everybody, to an extent, to understand the crisis that is being dealt with and how to get everybody on the same page to educate them. Now, when it comes to journalism, because you have different outlets, different people on the end of the spectrum, putting out different information, how, in your opinion, do you think we can all kind of come to one happy medium? And what other role do we play as journalists to be able to talk to, you know, the different ends of the spectrum and get them to understand that there is some sort of middle ground here? Because, in my opinion, I could be wrong, for as long as you have so many people kind of going against each other with their opinions, and you don't bring everybody together, you're not going to make real progress. So in your opinion, how do we kind of bring everybody to, you know, a more happy medium on this?
It's very difficult. And like I said, I think legacy media was able to have that sort of communal moment, whether it was, when I was growing up, it was always the 10 o'clock news at night, for example. You know, and the next day someone might say, did you see that on the news last night?
Right.
If someone said to you, if I said to you now, did you see that on the news last night? You'd be like, the news? Yeah. What, you know, what the hell's that? Right. Okay, because you mean, did I get it on WhatsApp?
Right.
Or did I see it on my feed on TikTok or whatever. And so it's much harder to have that communal moment. And I think we tend to have these moments when it comes to something like Netflix, where in a region, for example, Netflix might release a new film or a new series. And in that moment, a large number of us might be watching in that sense.
Right.
But in terms of news and information, we don't have that density anymore. So what do we need to do at CNN Al-Iqtisadiyya? I'll speak from that point of view. Is we have to identify who we're talking to, who's our audience. So obviously the most basic Arabic speaking, right? So immediately we know that. But we're in this region, so it'll primarily be, our target would be Gulf audiences. And you've got UAE and Saudi Arabia and other economies. And then we would say, okay, what do they need to know? And they're living their lives, they're looking for opportunity, they are connected. Why are they coming to a brand like CNN, which is ultimately an American brand? It's because they're looking for an international perspective, but it's in Arabic, so also they want something from the region. And then we think they're not going to come back to us unless we give them something useful. So we use all those touch points to decide in our morning meeting or our weekly meeting or our monthly meeting what stories we're going to prioritize. And then we're a visual storytelling platform. So if we can't do it visually, we might say, that's not for us. So we want video or infographics or animation, or it might be multimedia, so audio, podcast, for example. So all these factors will come in, and it comes down to what can we do best. So I don't think anybody can really deliver on all of what you're saying, what you're suggesting.
Right.
Anyone can do that anymore. And I don't even know if we should, to be honest. I think the diversity of voices and diversity of media is a good thing.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Now, you mentioned the region, and I couldn't help but think, if you look at the Middle East as a region, do you think the cultural aspect plays a role in actually adopting better practices, or the overall sustainable lifestyle? Does the culture play a role in being able to accept it quicker and move on? We know the UAE is leading by example, without a doubt. But how is that when it comes to other countries within the region?
So I'll qualify, because I'm not a cultural expert.
Right.
I'm an Arab. You're an Arab, right?
Right.
And that gives us a certain amount of understanding. I grew up in London, but I've now lived in this region for 20 years.
Right. And I like how you put it, by the way. So let's call it what it is. As Arabs,
Yes.
do you think Arabs overall actually buy in the idea of it?
So we had this discussion in the newsroom literally yesterday morning, where I was talking to the team and talking about our coverage here at COP28 and everything we're doing, and to remind ourselves, like I said, of why this matters. I said, as a people, we can be quite fatalistic at times, and kind of, inshallah, and what happens, and there's a real kind of I guess a resilience in us because of everything we've been through, not just in the last century, but many centuries. We go back, Iraqis, right? The Mongols in 1258 was
Absolutely.
like a climate disaster overnight to Baghdad, for example. They destroyed the whole agricultural system, and Baghdad never recovered, right?
Sure.
And so we've been through a lot. So we can almost have this thing of like, oh, and we'll survive this too. But to break through that and to kind of say, actually, we might not. We might not. And we've done some reporting on, and I'll step back and say this. I was doing an interview with a radio station in the UK a few weeks ago, building up to COP, and the presenter was British and was in London, and was the first question she asked me was, isn't it ironic that everyone's flying so far away to Dubai for a climate summit?
Absolutely.
And I said, it's not ironic.
Okay.
I said, it's the last thing is it's ironic. Why? Because no region has been impacted by climate change like the Middle East.
Right.
And not only that, no region has people like the Middle East in terms of looking for solutions. You mentioned the UAE, but it's not just the UAE, it's people on the ground. So CNN Al-Iqtisadiyya did a report about shepherds in Syria, for example, and the impact of drought and extreme weather on their livelihoods. That's just one example of how people are being affected. In Egypt, the mango crop is being impacted. Talk about the marsh Arabs in Iraq, what they've been through. I mean, they survived Saddam, but now they may not survive climate change. And so, everywhere you look in this region, you see the impact of what's happening. But I think audiences maybe don't necessarily put it all together and say, okay, that's happening here, that's happening there. It's a big thing that we all need to get through. And maybe that's where our role could come in, is as a platform and media in general, to show people it's happening in so many different pockets of this region, but also to show the positive side and say, you've got these entrepreneurs, you've got these people working on innovation, you've got governments working on initiatives. So we have both the disaster but the solution, and to see it as one actual narrative, then people might say, you know what, I really need to act. And then they start looking for reasons to act locally. And we do act. If I go back to Gaza, the phenomenal response of ordinary people to try and alleviate what's happening in Gaza has been incredible these past few weeks. And so I believe in the Middle East, once we reach that same level when it comes to climate, that same level of understanding, I don't think a region will be as successful as this one in terms of finding solutions.
Right. Now, we talk obviously about spreading awareness, you know, sustainable literacy, as we mentioned earlier. Someone asked me a question yesterday, and I found myself without an answer to it. And he said, you know, being in media, obviously, you know, we understand the message you're trying to spread, but how sustainable is your industry itself? And that really got me thinking is, sure, I understand, you know, we could try to get the message out, we could try to educate people on certain things, but how sustainable do you think our industry actually is? And have we made progress ourselves to be able to lead by example?
It's a good question. How sustainable is it? I don't have data.
Right.
So it's hard
But
to
that's the
answer
thing.
that, right?
That's why I said I actually found myself without an answer. So, you know, we typically sit here, we ask people questions, but I couldn't answer that particular question. And I really appreciated that question to be able to look at, you know, the media industry over the years.
Yeah.
Has it actually become more sustainable or not? And yeah, but that could be another topic of discussion for the next episode.
I mean, very briefly, I mean, I'll say that the industry is evolving. So there was a time when we were killing millions of trees to print the newsprint, which is no longer happening. But when we move to digital now, and increasingly with artificial intelligence, the demand for electricity and power, but also for data centers to accumulate all the data we're creating. Because ultimately, what are we doing as media? We're creating data, and we're storing data, and we're disseminating data. The platform doesn't even matter. And so that's going to require a lot of consumption of resources. And so really we have to look at how our infrastructure can be better managed, as well as our day-to-day practices. So it's very much something that I think we probably need to do a lot more on, but it will go hand in hand with what in general is happening, I think, with industry. And I think we can be part of the solution for sure.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you 100%. Speaking of vehicles, do you drive an electric vehicle?
I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't. And again,
you took the metro.
I did take the metro here to COP28.
Thoughts? Because a lot of people still haven't gotten on board with the metro thing.
Yeah, so embarrassingly, even though I've lived in the UAE since 2004, the first time I took the metro was 2 days ago, and it was to come to COP28, and it was partly because in the planning and when we were preparing everything here on site, and we had site visits, one of the feedback that came was, you've got to take the metro. If you try and drive and park here, it's going to lose a lot of time.
Right.
And quite simply, a reporter for CNN Al Qatadia might do an interview, and then because of the way our editing is set up, they can't complete their report until they get back to the office to do the final bit of editing. So, you know, they have 2 hours from when the interview is finished to actually get that report published. And so we worked out that if you're losing time parking and driving, then you're going to miss your deadline. So everyone's taking the metro. And I thought, as you know, the acting managing director, that I got to lead by example. So not only am I taking the metro, I'm also jumping on one of those Kareem bikes from the office and riding it to the metro station, and then getting the metro here and walking as much as possible. Not only is it healthier and more sustainable, but actually it goes to show that Dubai is quite, in many ways, not in every way, there's still a way to go, but in many ways it's kind of setting a blueprint for in this region of how you build a more sustainable transport infrastructure. But the question of electric vehicles, I'm still not sure if an electric vehicle is the solution.
Right.
Maybe we have to just drive less is maybe the solution.
Absolutely.
rather than all of
Right.
us turning around and selling up petrol vehicles and diesel vehicles and buying EVs.
Right. Uh, any expectations from the remaining few days of COP28 here? I mean, obviously, we know that it's been off to a great start. As you said, highest number of attendees so far. And not only that, but I believe also the highest amount of money raised towards sustainability did happen here. The UAE with $100 million. I think Germany also with $100 million. Um, Japan, I think it was around 76 million. Interestingly enough, though, to see the US had actually contributed the least, with I think somewhere around $17 million. Why do you think that is?
So the progress on some of these initiatives are, let's be fair, long overdue. Again, it comes back to Paris. So we had $100 billion that finally the rich countries had delivered on for the developing countries that was promised in Paris. But also the estimates for what's needed have considerably moved. Until 2030, the expectation for developing economies is they need about $2.5 trillion a year
Wow.
to manage everything related to the transition. But for example, the successes at COP28, the loss and damage fund, which you were talking about, various
Correct.
countries, Germany, UAE, the US, the small amount, that was a very important moment for this COP to show that there could be common ground.
Right.
Now, overall, the criticism is that you need billions, not hundreds of millions,
Right.
for the loss and damage. But at least it sets a tone
Sure.
for everyone agreeing what is required. And it's a starting point. But we are behind. So for the US to, as the largest economy, the largest emitter, to give, a smaller amount than, say,
Right.
Germany
Right.
to developing countries is political.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you asked me, what are my expectations? Well, my expectations are is we will see a lot of politics, because really the constituency for a lot of the negotiators isn't necessarily here in COP28, where you're talking to the choir, where everyone agrees on what needs to be
Sure.
done, but the message that you give back home when you go
Absolutely.
back. And, the politics might be a little bit more polarized, and governments are at risk from the right or the left of pandering too much or not doing enough. And the US actually is one of those countries that has, a very staunch pro-climate group,
Right.
but also right now a very vocal and influential minority, particularly on the Republican side. The Democrats obviously in power now, but the Republican side, who say that the US is spending too much money abroad and spending too much money in general. I mean, they are constantly having to renegotiate on the US government spending bill, for example. And many people are saying that the government is spending too much, and it's politics, and you're going into an election year. So I don't know exactly whether that's what drove the actual figure, but the fact that they gave money at all is probably a win. And you've got Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, coming to COP28 to give a speech. You already had John Kerry, their climate envoy, who was here.
Sure.
And actually the US presence is quite strong. And again, I come back to what's happening with Gaza. It's not necessarily the best time for a US senior official to visit this region, given the tensions and the animosity and the anger. So I think despite the politics, I expect there to be a lot of progress by the end of this COP, partly because also of the work being done by the UAE presidency. Sultan Al Jaber, who assumed the presidency, has been going around the world for the past year. But also you saw the UAE president, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, announce the $30 billion climate fund to help close the climate finance gap. And that's backed by private institutions, as well as the US. The US, Joe Biden, the president, put out a statement, the White House put out a statement backing this terror fund, saying how important it is. And so you're seeing a lot of cooperation. We're seeing a lot of initiatives. Now, everything ultimately will depend about what happens after COP with the implementation of how the money's spent. Is there equity in how the money is spent? For example, the loss and damage fund is being administered by the World Bank. A lot of developing countries weren't happy about the World Bank administering it. Who is the World Bank? They're backed by the rich countries.
Right.
And so there's still so much that is unanswered. But what do we expect out of COP28? Ultimately is to know where we stand in terms of 1.5 degrees. And I don't think that's going to be a good prognosis. And then a commitment that everyone understands we haven't done enough and we have to do more going forward. I expect at least those two things to happen, as well as the announcements for money and finance and other initiatives.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly hope that we can see some progress being made from this amazing event happening right here. Any final words you'd like to add in?
Well, I mean, it's great to talk to you about these things. It's great to have, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, to have the opportunity to discuss a nuanced story. For anyone, I mean, I'm not a climate expert. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've learned, because there are really, really smart people who are climate journalists out there covering this, and I'm reading and watching and observing what they're doing. And they kind of do the important job of day in, day out on this. The mainstream media, the best we can do is kind of piggyback on that and try and deliver at the right times when there's a mainstream moment, like now with COP28. So it's a privilege to do this. It's a privilege to talk to you, Omar.
Thank you.
And a privilege to be on this platform that Trends has provided. So thank you so much.
Well, so thank you very much for your time and for sharing all this insight with us. And we certainly look forward to having you once again. All right. Well, there you have it. We were with the acting managing director of CNN Iqtisadiya. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and be sure to tune in to the next episode coming in tomorrow. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.